Just preparing. Chloe, you good with doing the intro?
Yep.
Okay.
So thank you again for joining us, Eden. Obviously, Eden is author of the wonderful middle grade that we just read, Root Magic. Sorry? Okay. Root Magic is about two twins, Jez and Jay. They're Gullah Geechee, and the story takes place in like the 60s. And it's about them learning root work from their Uncle Doc. And it's about the challenges that they're facing in school and the supernatural forces that are pursuing them. So thank you again for joining us. I was now going to open the floor to members who had questions about the story. And if you don't feel comfortable asking them, you can throw them in the chat and I can ask for you.
I feel like I should have written all this down. Now I'm like blanking out. But I have to say, though, that I enjoyed reading the book very much just because it was so lush and the imagery was so vivid and it just felt like a whole movie to me. So I really enjoyed the journey.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that greatly. And I also wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me to do this today.
I have a question. First, I have a million questions. I will start with this. I will start with just one. So the story is bookended by funerals. And given that it's a middle grade book, I'm curious about like your reasons for that and if that had any connection to the fact that, the audience is so young. So.
Well, looking at middle grade fiction, this is the first middle grade thing that I've ever written. It's the first novel I've ever written. And I felt like when I was a younger person, a lot of the discussions that went on around me, not that I was necessarily involved in them, but a lot of these discussions revolved around things that people might see as tough subjects now. They were people who had passed away. How are we going to honor them? What were we going to do with their last moments? What happened to people from a point of view of losing other family members or violence and things like that? There are discussions that went on in the family that I think helped me sort of start to understand the world a little bit more, at least from my point of view. And I think that kids need to have a way of processing information that they realize things are happening, but it isn't always easy for adults to have conversations with them about tough things. And kids want to be grown up. They want to kind of understand and they want to be a part of things. And I think sometimes adults feel like, well, I don't want to let them in and I don't want to educate them on this because they're too young to hear about such difficult topics. But difficult things are going on in the world all around them, and being able to have a basis for processing those types of things very early, I think can be incredibly helpful to kids. So the Gullah Geechee funeral tradition is, obviously it's grounded a lot in African traditions, but it's not always a mournful process. It is in Root Magic a difficult thing for the kids to navigate initially because they've lost a big part of their lives. And then all of a sudden, all these other things start coming and flooding their lives, and they're having to adjust constantly. But the final funeral is more of an acceptance and a way to move on. So I wanted to contrast those two homegoing services.
Mm.
I guess I had a question about, recently, with everything that's going on, I've been finding out a lot more about or relearning about Native American culture and the things that we should not be doing with items that they revere or use ritually. And I was reading about the sweetgrass, and that was one of the things that was a native thing to use. And I was just wondering, that's part of our culture too?
It is part of our. Oh, sorry, you weren't finished asking your question.
Yeah, just using sweetgrass and braiding it. And
it is. It's part of, at least it's part of that Gullah Geechee corridor connection. And when you look at the things that are used for basket making, sweetgrass is the one that's most popular. It's the one that most people are familiar with. But there are other grasses that you can use. You can use bulrushes, and there are other palmetto leaves, lots of things you can use. Technically, you can use telephone wire to make baskets out of. One of my friends went to Sierra Leone and did some filming, and you can see the similarities in Gullah Geechee basket making and the basket making that's done in that area. So it is part of our culture as well, and it's part of how we are able to sort of make that connection with the land and pass that on to a lot of our descendants. I certainly can't do it any longer because it is very, very hard on your hands. But I've started projects and done small projects, and certainly have put it in a lot of my work so that people can understand that that is also a part of our culture as well.
thank you.
My pleasure. Any other questions?
Hi, I really enjoyed reading this story, and I thought the sibling relationships, both with Jess and Jay and Doc and Mom, were very interesting. I'm one of eight, and so I really enjoyed watching different dynamics between the two sets of siblings. And I wondered if you could speak more on like your inspiration behind their relationship and kind of more about the two different sibling dynamics.
Absolutely. Sibling dynamics are something that I had to learn from observing. I don't have a sibling. I'm an only child. So I've looked at my mother's sisters. I looked at my grandmother's sisters. My grandmother was actually one of 8. So, and my mother was one of 3. So I always felt that there was something special about the sibling relationship. And looking at it from the outside in, I wanted to show on the page that there are lots of different ways that we communicate with each other when we're that close. Mm-hmm. And Doc and Mama are very close, even though they don't agree on everything. And certainly Jez and Jay are very close, especially in that we're still kids. We should sort of work things out between ourselves before we decide if we're going to go to the adults about it. So it was a lot of sort of reminiscing for me, looking back at sibling relationships that I'm familiar with. I did have a writer that I'm friends with who has twins. He has a boy and a girl. They're younger than Jez and Jay, but he was kind enough to do a sensitivity read for me because I said, I really want to make sure that I get this right, that sort of communication, not just between siblings, but communication between twins that are minutes apart. So I had lots of, thankfully, people to read for me to say, I think you've done this right, or this feels real, this feels authentic, because that is outside of my personal experience. So I wanted to make sure that I brought in people that had that to give me some sort of direction and guidance and make sure I was staying on the right path with that. I think that with the sibling relationship with Doc and Mama, they're obviously older, but they also have had lots of difficulties in keeping their relationship strong because they haven't lived next to each other the entire time. Because in the book, they come to stay with Mom after her husband disappears. So they are I didn't go into it in the book because a lot of this is from the kids' POV, and they don't know a lot of that history. But there is a lot of history between Mama and Doc as far as why don't they live near each other? This is a Gullah Geechee community in the 1960s. People lived very close together, especially people who were family. So who knows? That might be another book to explore that dynamic. There you go. But I think the kids, the younger kids, they have this sort of innocence about the world, and they come to the page a little bit differently. Jez is very desirous of doing what her mom wants, so she uses standard English most of the time, even though she understands Gullah, she understands Geechee, and Jay pretty much just feels like, you know what I'm saying. Why should I bother code switching in this situation? You know exactly what I'm trying to say. So that's also sort of a differential between the two siblings, and a differential just that I try to reflect about the community itself. Some people who really speak standard English most of the time, even though they understand Gullah or Geechee, and then other people who feel like, I'm not going to code switch. You know, you can figure out what I'm saying, and if you're not sure, you can ask. So hopefully that answered your question.
It does. Thank you so much. And I thought you did a great job.
Thank you so much. That was one of the things I was concerned about. Am I getting this sibling relationship correct?
I want to be like generous with the question asking space. So I have more, but does anybody who hasn't asked yet want to ask something?
Yeah, could I ask one really quick? So I was curious, you know, you're Gullah Geechee and this is about Gullah Geechee children, and I know there's like a joy in like sharing your culture and like writing for like people from your culture. And I know that you also wrote a short story, Sweetgrass Blood, about someone who shares knowledge that they shouldn't in a place that they shouldn't. And I was wondering if that is a tension that you had to navigate when writing the story between things that are like okay for everyone to know and things that are kind of just like for those who need to know, they can know. That was something I had to navigate, like how you felt about, if you feel that tension at all.
I definitely do, and that's where the impetus for that story, Sweetgrass Blood, came from. That short story was born from my starting a project and wondering exactly how much of my culture to put on the page. Because a lot of times, once you put that out in the world, you don't know how it's going to be received. You don't know who's going to sort of pick it up and run off with it, if they're then going to portray it as accurately as you would like. And that's where that story came from. And I actually finished that story before I finished that project, because there is this concern where you're portraying your culture on the page and you want to do it honestly because it feels authentic and it makes the work that you're doing feel more real, versus would my grandmother, grandparents, great grandparents, would my ancestors want me sharing this information? Because historically, we as Gullah Geechee people have been very sort of loath to do that, and loath to sort of go outside our communities and share that. And it's that sort of seclusion that's really kept us and kept those connections that we have alive for so long. So I just decided that in order to be as authentic as I can on the page, I do want to present the language authentically. I do want to present some of the practices authentically, but you won't be able to take those exact things that happen in root magic and then do a spell yourself. So I did have to change things in order to present them clearly, but not necessarily give a lesson in root work.
Thank you for explaining that.
Oh, absolutely.
I was wondering about your writing process and what was the most pleasurable part of the book to write for you? And then what was the most challenging part of the story to write?
I'll go with the most challenging part first. The most challenging part to write, I think, was the funeral scene, the original funeral scene where they're putting grandma to rest. And my grandmother was an enormous part of my life, and it brought back a lot of those memories from when she passed away. And that particular scene that begins the book was not the original place that the book started. So that was a passage that I wrote after the fact, sort of way into edits. And I realized that the book needed to start somewhere else. And I thought, well, we need to start with showing something that's from the culture on the page, but also sort of level set and give an understanding of where we are in the world. What's the temperature like? What are the people like? Because I learned that in this process of bringing this book to fruition, I was really, to my knowledge, the only Black person involved with the project. I was the only Southerner involved with the project. And from my interactions, I could tell that a lot of people were very unfamiliar with the part of the world that I'm writing about. They were very unfamiliar with the people that I'm writing about. So when I got my edits, it was an incredibly long list of, can you clarify this? We're not sure about this. What does this mean? Is this the wording you'd like to use? Do you want to change this person's dialogue? So I had pages and pages of that to go through. And one of my edits was, can we start the book just really dropping us in to the culture? So I went back after the fact and wrote that opening scene. So I'm glad to know that it fits and it feels seamless, because it wasn't originally there. As far as the most enjoyable or the most fun part to write, I write a lot of dark fiction, so a lot of the scarier parts were fun to write, because when I go in to write them, I know she's going to make it out the other end. Other people reading it for the first time may not know, and it's unnerving and it's scary and it's worrisome, but I know she's going to be okay. So I know that I can create this scary, nerve-wracking scene, and she's going to be fine. My father-in-law called me and he said, I'm reading your book, but I had to stop because I had to ask you, is that little girl going to be okay? So I don't want to finish reading it if she's not going to be okay. So I said, she's going to be fine. You can continue reading it. She's going to be absolutely fine. Don't worry. So once I got that phone call and saw how concerned he was, I thought, okay, well, I must have gotten this right then.
Well, you did, because some of that stuff is downright creepy. And I was like, how old is she again? Like, a couple times I had to remind myself, they just turned 11. And I was like, pins? Oh my gosh. Right. And, but, I think that's something that you said earlier about the fact that I think that we, the world, we can sometimes be a little naive about how horror-free the lives of children are. And,
yes.
And Black children in particular, and Black children in this particular historical moment, like they are seeing and taking in a lot of inputs. And I think that is like, it's so important to be able to demonstrate their resilience. And if I can just like pour love on you a little bit, I
Please.
loved Jet. Like I know we've talked about and like giggled about this book before you came here. So just so that we had a lot of time to talk about it. I loved Jez. I loved Jez as a character. I was definitely rooting for her, and I loved how easily she took to the magic. I loved how her magic developed, and that she had a private like magical arc that no one really knew about until a little bit later. So we got to see her exploring her own talents and her own power and like discovering that on her own. And that was really amazing. Dinah creeped the bejesus out of me for a minute. I had feelings about Susie. I didn't know what she was, but at some part of the book, I was just like, Susie's not quite as she seems. And I mean, I think I've read that like a good writer is able to find the balance between like the suspension of disbelief, right? Like holding us in that moment so that it's not like what we're reading is too believable to be boring or too out of this world to be like to capture our imagination. And like I was asking questions about Susie till like the reveal. Like I had like 4 different conspiracy theories about who / what / when Susie was, and I didn't guess. I wasn't right. And I read a lot of books, so I'm like I was stumped. I was wrong, and it was actually fun to be wrong because I wasn't expecting her to be who she was. So yeah, so I guess that leads into my question about Susie and what your experience was like with that character. And there's also somebody in the chats. There's a content creator who reads a lot of middle grade, How to Train Your Gavin, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, I loved Root Magic so much." So like, there's just a lot of love for the book.
Well, I am super, super pleased to know that. One of the things that I heard early on in the process of publishing was that the expectation was that the book would only really appeal to readers from or in the American South. And the expectation wasn't that it would necessarily find a wide readership. So I'm elated to know that the readership has expanded beyond those initial ideas of what it would be. As far as the hag character, hags, blue hags, are a Gullah Geechee creature, monster if you would like to use that term, from folklore. And they are pretty much exclusively female characters. And I love writing about the dynamics of being female in stories and books and how it can sometimes be vilified when it shouldn't be. And when we look at female characters, a lot of times the expectation is female characters are always nurturing and they always do the right thing. They always just sort of give everything until it hurts. And I like sort of flipping that sometimes. And I like having this creature who is presenting herself as a young girl to be able to get what she needs a little bit later, and then sort of almost falling into really caring about another human being. And I think a lot of times when you look at some of the work that I've done mostly for adults, when I use blue hag creatures, they are sometimes vilified by other creatures because they don't let themselves get caught up into the expectations of traditional female archetypes. They don't let themselves get drained beyond, their capacity. They don't overwork themselves just giving themselves endlessly. When they get to a point where they just say, that's enough, they drop it and they're gone. They shed that skin, they become someone else, and they leave it. And that's typically something that we don't associate with female characters. So I wanted to actually bring that character to a younger audience and have that, understanding. And a lot of these are themes that I think kids learn early on, but adults don't always realize that kids do sometimes learn early on. People sometimes pretend to be your friend when they really aren't your friend. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that's a hard lesson that kids learn probably a little bit earlier than adults realize. Because sometimes, especially in I shouldn't say especially in that time period, because I think it still happens now, where kids can be incredibly cruel to each other and make examples of each other. And now you can film it, and now you can, really humiliate other kids if you want to be cruel and tease them. And I think that having something from a supernatural point of view to show an extreme of that happening is really what I wanted to present in Root Magic. There's this creature that befriends Jez, and she's so excited because her first spell, it's worked. She's got a friend. And realizing, that there's this betrayal later on of, oh, well, you really weren't my friend. You were really trying to get something out of me. And then eventually Susie having her redemption arc of being able to, on the final end, when the chips are down, so to speak, be able to help.
Where did your imagery for Czar come from?
Oh, wow. Czar is a place that people have always talked about, but no one obviously really has a grasp on. You can actually read about Czar I think you can even read about it in some of Zora Hurston's work. But she acknowledges that lots of people talked about it, but no one knew what it was. No one knew how to explain it to her. It was a place beyond far, but how do you know exactly where that is? And is it a place that we see as hopeful, that we want to go? Is it a place that's already inhabited? What's there? So I tried to take almost like a child's point of view of what the furthest place would be and what the most sort of amazing experience would be. But I wanted it to be a bit nebulous with what sort of individuals inhabited a place like that. But I wanted Jez to feel this amazing acceptance that she doesn't typically get when she's at home or around other kids. And I wanted her to have this experience where she is around younger individuals and she's having a good time, but she has to make that decision of, do I stay here around kids that are accepting me and I'm having a good time, or do I go back to a place where there's lots of hard times and challenges and things like that? But that's where my family is. That's where my people are. And that's where I will have a future. So that was my imagination of what a place like that would be, especially from a child's POV.
It was beautiful.
Thank you so much.
I think we have time for one more question before Eden's half hour with us comes to an end.
That was quick. That 30 minutes.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
It's more of a logistics type question that I've been thinking about since I finished the book. And in the ending, the climax where we have kind of who in my mind is the big bad for the book, and that altercation that happens afterwards. What happens to the car, basically, is what I want to know. What happens to the evidence around that? Just general encounter to make it so that our next scene picks up and there doesn't seem to be ramifications to the family for what has transpired. Because we're clearly in a system where that would be very bad. And so
Absolutely.
I was just wondering what is happening there for you.
For me, even though that doesn't make it onto the page, we have this sort of fade to black moment.
Right.
And then we come back, but that's why Sheriff Edwards comes to visit the next day. And he spends time with the family asking if everybody's okay. And in my mind, he makes things go away. Because typically we as Black people, we don't get that. We don't get somebody coming in saying, okay, I know what went down here, and me just leave it with me, and I'll tidy this up for you. So that was my sort of imagining of what happened, all of those, the car, all of those bits and pieces, all of that. That's sort of Sheriff Edwards doing. He sort of waves his magic wand, so to speak, and handles things.
There's two comments. So B. Thompson says, so Eden, you were saying that you got some early feedback, or you were wondering whether people outside the American South would value the story. And B. Thompson says, well, that was a lie. What the people who said to you that people outside the South might not value the story, B responds, well, that was a lie. My up north cousins loved this book. Zealy says, a favorite part of Jez's character growth was engaging Susie as the hag, stepping out on that limb to ask questions, because despite what she had done and is, Jez still thought of her as her friend, as a friend. So.
Yes, and I kind of wanted to just mention that very quickly, because Susie is what's considered a monster. And because I write a lot of horror, I watch a lot of horror, and so often in horror, when people encounter the monster, they see that it's different from them, and there is no thinking. The conclusion is immediate of, we have to destroy it. There's never any inquiry of, why is this monster here? Is this something that we can engage differently? Should we even be in this monster's space? Should we just leave and go into another situation? So I wanted Jez to be that person that is not going to immediately strike out against something that she doesn't understand, because I think a lot of times that happens way too much in our society. A lot of times it happens to Black and brown people disproportionately, because no one asks any questions first. Everybody acts first. And I wanted Jez to just take the initiative and say, I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out why this is, and ask you questions, and then I'm going to decide what to do. And she ends up deciding to help.
I have one small question. What is the coin and what's going to happen to it?
I am trying to decide how to answer that question. Conclusions already being drawn, I see. I wanted to leave myself a thread for my own purposes, in case anybody wants any more of these characters in the story or whatever. I wanted to leave a thread that I could pick up, something that was small, that wouldn't, leave a big gaping hole, in the story, but something that if you read the first book, you could come back to and say, oh, I remember that happening. I remember where she got this. And, I just wanted to leave myself, a little thread to weave off of later. When and if anybody says, hey, we'd like another one of these books. So who knows if that will happen? I have no idea. Nobody's told me anything.
Who do we have to email? What do you need? Who do we email? Who do we send this video to? Like, what's the plan?
I would say, I don't know if any of you, if you would tweet me or anything like that.
Yes.
That would be great, because my publishers, they do monitor my social media. I shouldn't say monitor. They do look at my social media. That was one of the things that I noticed early on. So if that's something that would be of interest to anyone, then
we're on it
to do that.
We've got it covered. Thanks. It's great.
and thank you for asking that question. That's the first time anyone has asked me that specific question. So I wondered if anybody noticed that little thread.
I'm very excited about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
My pleasure, my absolute pleasure.
We I know we're out of time. Chloe, there's a question in the chat, so I'm gonna leave it to your leadership. Somebody has another one.
Do you have time for one more question, Eden?
I have time, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. This is from That's So Po, who says that she's from the West Coast and she very much valued the story for sure. And so the difference between the short story of Doc Buzzard's Coffin in Spook Lights and Root Magic.
So Doc Buzzard's Coffin is one of the short stories in my first collection, and that is definitely written for an adult audience. It's not canon for the Root Magic world or anything like that, but it was my exploration of these characters, and I loved them. And with that collection, most of my stories had to be 5,000 words or less in order for them to sort of fit into what I was doing. And I thought, am I going to leave these characters alone? And I thought, no, they're going to get another full-length story. And I ended up spending a lot of time working with them and coming up with something that felt like a wonderful way to sort of introduce them and present them. And it just so happens that it ended up being a middle grade. So it's not a canon story, but it was just my way of sort of exploring characters and plot and scene. And I'm on my to-do list. I'm looking at it right now. I have a plot to, or I plan to move another one of my short stories into a novel. And it's something that, I'm still sort of working with, but trying to figure out how to do that. So if you've ever read Every Goodbye Ain't Gone, that's the one I'm thinking of. So plans are being made. So we'll see how that goes and if anyone's interested in reading that story.
Terry's already writing that down in the reading planner.
And that story, it's you can read it, and I think it's also been podcast as well. So if you prefer audio, you can listen to it as well. The wonderful Stephanie Malia Morris narrated that story for me for Strange Horizons.
I wonder, I'll just share with you, it's not a question, but there's a scene where Jay and Tony are by the tree and we don't exactly know what's happening. We see them from behind. And as you may or may not know, Solar Powered it's centered around the perspectives of queer readers who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color and allies. And so for me as a Black queer woman reading it, I was like, what are they doing? What is happening? Is Tony bullying Jay? Are they fighting? Is this like, are we going to walk into like some cute kiss? Like what's going to happen? And I also noticed that at one point, Mama says to Jay, like some men wear bracelets. And I wasn't sure if that was like a nod to, here's a way that we can sort of like open up gender identity in a middle grade book. And I will say that I have been looking for middle grade books that address sexual orientation and gender identity because we're told that these are not children appropriate topics, but they obviously are. And there are lots of middle grade books and more now that are doing that really, really well, like Case and Calendar's Hurricane Child as an example, and many others. So if the sequel that we're going to petition for actually happens, I am just saying that I am looking for more queer and gender identity representation in our middle grade books. And if there's a space for that, if that's what you were hinting at in Root Magic, in at least the scene where Mom is like, some men wear bracelets, then I think we're hungry for it. And that's important.
And I think too, there's sometimes this, I'm going to use the word narrow, there's this narrow sort of imagination of what masculinity is and how masculinity can present itself. And I think that opening that up and sort of embracing, that it can be whatever the individual wants it to be, is an important thing to reinforce. And I do actually I want to tell you all of my works in progress, or bombard you with all of that. But I'm working on a YA currently, right now, and I'm exploring that with one of my characters. And certainly, just like I did with Root Magic and most of my work, I try to reach out to a person with that identity to read it, to say, let me know what I've gotten right, what I've gotten wrong, how I can improve. So that is something that, I am juggling with, all of these projects up in the air. So hopefully I'll be able to get something finished and out fairly soon. We'll see.
That's so good to hear. Thank you. Thank you for answering all the questions.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for reading Root Magic and for your kind words and encouragement. And it was absolutely wonderful to hear. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. And before we leave, a reminder to everyone with the Twitter, if you read Root Magic and you loved it, you want a sequel, we're tweeting Eden Royce. We're saying how much we loved it and that we would like a sequel and that we would love to see more novels from her because publishing values that.
Right. So we're going to end the live broadcast now. So for everybody watching in YouTube land, thank you very much for watching and tweeting and, sharing in the chats how much you love the book and for asking questions for Eden Royce. We see you and thanks for being a part of the conversation. I'm going to